This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 991 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by DraftKings. Thanks for tuning in. You heard that right. DraftKings is now sponsoring the Late Round Podcast, and there's a lot of news that comes with that. One is that Becoming a Best Ball Bro is officially back. Rich Ryan and I are going to sit down and do another season of the show where I talk to some of the greatest best ball players on earth about how to tackle the game. And this year, of course, it'll focus on DraftKings Best Ball, which I'm really excited to get into because it's a full PPR platform. That first episode is going to drop on Monday. It's usually going to be on Wednesdays, but for this one, it's on Monday, so get ready for that. Second, as you guys know, I hired on David Kitchen to be Late Round Fantasy Football COO back at the beginning of the year. And Kitchen and I have been working behind the scenes on a whole lot of cool stuff. One of those things is the Late Round Fantasy Football Show. Coming soon to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel will be a live weekly show with Kitchen and me. We're going to dig into all things fantasy football. So it's another outlet for you and I to interact, and it's another place for me to throw my takes out there. And then lastly, the Late Round Draft Guide, it's officially available for pre-order. You can still get the Late Round Prospect Guide and all that comes with it over on lateround.com, but the Draft Guide, that's available for pre-order too. For those who don't know, the Late Round Draft Guide is where I lay out as much game theory as I can possibly lay out for the upcoming season. And then in that guide, you also get my rankings and tiers, my players to target and avoid, and my late round dart throws. And those rankings and tiers and those players to target and avoid, those are all updated weekly once the guide launches. Both guides can be found on lateround.com. The pre-order price for the draft guide is $24.99. That's going to increase by $5 on July 1st when it launches. Then, like I said, each week through August, you'll get weekly updates to that guide. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on with Late Round Fantasy Football. Becoming a Best Ball Bro Season 2, the Late Round Fantasy Football flagship show on YouTube, and then the Late Round Draft Guide. All of those things are coming very, very soon. But yeah, that's all the news for now. It's a mailbag day. Let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Noah. It says, I'm eager to hear your breakdown on the Pickins trade and the ripple effect of the trade. How much do you expect this to affect the skill players of the team? Dak, DK Metcalf, but even deeper guys like Roman Wilson. So I think this was a trade that really helped fantasy football just in general, all around. Let's start with Dallas. CeeDee Lamb is going to be locked into a high target share regardless of his competition. So adding Pickens really won't impact him dramatically. Now there's the classic argument of, does having a player like Pickens open things up more for Lamb, or does it hurt Lamb because he's now having to share more looks with a capable wide receiver? And I think in this case, there was so much target share up for grabs in Dallas because of their lack of depth. You could argue this won't really impact Lamb at all, or that it's a good thing for him even. I see it as mostly neutral. Pickens, though, goes from a run-heavy offense, which I'll get to in a second, to one that's more than likely going to be pass-friendly. Brian Schottenheimer was Dallas's offensive coordinator in 2023 and 2024, and now obviously he's the head coach. But as OC in Dallas, the Cowboys had neutral script pass rates that ranked 5th and 6th in the league. And remember, last year they saw Cooper Rush start 8 games for them. This is likely going to be a pass-heavy team, especially when you look at the running backs they have. So Pickens, I think, goes from kind of an undesirable situation to a pretty good one. I think it was a win for his fantasy value, especially with the quarterback upgrade. Now, speaking of that quarterback, when it comes to someone like Dak, I'm not going to be aggressive with almost any sort of pocket passer type unless they're super cheap. We know that passing touchdowns are going to drive a quarterback scoring, a pocket passer quarterback scoring. And touchdowns bring variance. This is what the pocket passer trap episode was all about. But there obviously are going to be some quarterbacks that we feel more confident can provide that touchdown upside versus others, especially when they have a pass-friendly coordinator and decent weapons. So I think Dak is kind of like a high-end QB2, where he has a shot to give you true mid to low-end QB1 upside if things really hit. Now, Pittsburgh, they don't have the most desirable passing situation. They were 22nd in neutral script pass rate last year. They were 29th in overall pass rate. And Arthur Smith offenses, when he was in Atlanta as head coach, they were 26th, 30th, and 9th in neutral script pass rate. Then in Tennessee, they were 30th and 25th. And at each stop, his team's overall pass rates were even lower. It's just not a fantasy-friendly offense for receivers because of the lack of passing volume. But what can help in these situations is a high target share. When George Pickens and DK Metcalf were both in Pittsburgh together, now they didn't play together obviously, but from a projection standpoint, the projection was more split. But now Metcalf has an opportunity, at least a shot, to reach like that 27% target share mark. We don't project that kind of thing to happen, but that could lead to 130, 140 targets if things really break his way. Again, I don't think we should project that, but it at least gives Metcalf more room to breathe. That wasn't really the case when Pickens was in the mix. And it's the same deal with someone like Pat Freiermuth. Now, I don't think Freiermuth is ever going to be like a high ceiling fantasy tight end, but Smith's offenses are usually tight end heavy. And without Pickens, that could lead to more looks for Freiermuth. The other wide receivers to me, they're more waiver wire guys. Roman Wilson was a solid slot prospect, but they also have Calvin Austin. He ran 62% of his routes from the slot last year. They've got Robert Woods now, and he's probably going to play opposite of DK Metcalf at the time of this recording. But overall, I'm not going to be super excited about the number 2 wideout in an Arthur Smith offense. And it's an Arthur Smith offense that right now doesn't even have a quarterback, or at least a legit quarterback. And it's not like the number 2 wide receiver in that offense is some obvious stud. So that's how I see it. Overall, I think it was a win for fantasy football. The next question is also from Patreon. It's from Eric. It says, "Hey JJ, at what point do we not allow for draft capital to matter for wide receiver prospects? It's such a skilled position, and the opportunity is usually plentiful when you consider it's mostly 3 wide receiver sets in the NFL. I feel like we should not let high draft capital sway us in rookie drafts. But I don't know that breaking point. If their production profile is underwhelming in college, then I think it's safe to say draft capital won't net them a strong target share in the NFL. They still need to get open. I get it with running backs and draft capital, that makes sense to me. But I'm starting to just let the college production profile dictate things over the draft capital. It's like an 80-20 split for me right now, but I don't know if that's too harsh or not." Well, first off, this is exactly why I have the ZAP model. Because it's factoring in draft capital and production metrics in a rational way. It's sort of answering this question. Now, I don't think there's some hard split for every single player across the entirety of the position. But here's some general thoughts on draft capital, why it matters, and why I wouldn't only lean on a production profile, at least as heavily as you seem to be leaning on it. Production profile is still a pretty vague term. We have to make sure we're looking at the right kind of production that's actually predictive. Not just like raw yardage totals and such. Not to say that that's what you're doing, but it's important to give that context. Then you should look at things like program and schedule strength, competition strength, and so on. Production itself is a pretty complex thing to wrap your head around because there are so many different ways to measure production. Some players will undeniably have great production, but the vast majority of players will have weird profiles that you have to kind of sift through and figure out why certain things look the way that they do. Luther Burden was a perfect example of that this year. When you say you're going to rely so heavily on a production profile, how are you actually rating and grading that production profile? Like, to you, does Luther Burden have an elite production profile? Is it better than Tet McMillan's? Now, I obviously have certain metrics like breakout score that I'm going to rely on, but that's not the end all. We still need context. Meanwhile, there are going to be a lot of players who sort of just sit in the middle when it comes to production profiles. And there are plenty of successful NFL wide receivers who had average profiles in college. You need more to differentiate from one player to the next to see who's really good and who isn't. I've always looked at production profiles sort of from the perspective of, are they really, really good or are they really, really bad? Are they green flags or red flags? And then I'll kind of go from there in elevating or downgrading a player. But draft capital is unbelievably important at all positions. Inherently, it's a film evaluation for a player because picks are not just made via analytics, but it's also giving us some sort of ranking for a player just naturally. Those rankings are just coming from teams. And if you test draft capital versus almost any production metric out there, draft capital is going to be more predictive than that production metric. But like the ZAP model does, when you bring it all together, it's way more predictive than those standalone values. So I would advise anyone listening to this to not toss out draft capital. There will be players where the draft capital just doesn't match up to their production profile. And you can say to yourself, hey, I may be higher or lower on that player based on this information. But if you went with some like 80-20 split like you're referring to, you'd be drafting a whole lot of random day 3 wide receivers who will never hit. And you'd miss out on some players in the early rounds who maybe just had slightly below average production profiles, but they end up hitting. That happens a lot. But like I said, the mix that you're referring to here, that's what the ZAP model is for. This is why I built that model, because it helps properly weigh all of these inputs. The next question is from Twitter, is from @the_Tonian. It says, last year, your opinion on Chase Brown and Dynasty changed during the summer. Post NFL draft, are there any players you're thinking differently about? Can be a rookie or veteran player. Yeah, so last year, I started in January thinking that Chase Brown was actually a sell. And then I did some research on it in March and April. I realized that I probably should have the opposite stance, at least in redraft. So I pivoted, and it ended up being a good pivot. Look, guys, that's how I operate. I will gladly change my opinion on something with new information. That information in this case was just more research. Now, I don't think I have a player this year where I've done like a complete 180, like I did with Chase Brown last year. Like, Brown went from someone that I thought was a sell to someone I aggressively targeted. But one player who might count for this is Ricky Pearsall. Now, not to bring up Rome Odunze again, but players like Odunze, players like Pearsall, they have those kind of mediocre first-year peripherals. They tend to not give us high-end fantasy production throughout their careers. That's just based on history. Like, that's factual. It's rare for wide receivers to become stars in the league after poor peripherals during their rookie seasons. Devontae Adams will happen. DeAndre Hopkins will happen. But we can't say that that's the norm. So if we don't consider cost at all, it's easy to say you should probably lean more sell than buy with those players. Because there's a greater than 50% chance, way greater than 50% chance that those players are not going to burn you in the long run if you do trade them away, once things are all said and done. Now, that's also more of a dynasty take. And as I've already said with Odunze earlier this week, I think you can make strong arguments either way for Rome Odunze. And I think you can do the same for Ricky Pearsall. I know that some of you aren't going to believe me when I say this, but I really don't have super strong stances for those second-year wideouts on the dynasty front. Now, since this question was Chase Brown focused, I figured I'd answer this from a season-long redraft perspective, because that's where my mind really changed for Brown. I didn't really flip my stance that aggressively in dynasty, because there was a shot that he'd be a one-year wonder, if things hit. Turns out that wasn't the right read a year ago, but it was the right read to aggressively draft him in redraft. Now with Pearsall, not so much Odunze, because I saw more favorable outcomes for Odunze when I did my year 2 wide receiver research this offseason, but with Ricky Pearsall, I was a little bit more concerned when writing up his year 2 profile, and you can find that in the prospect guide. Partially because, man, he had a stretch last year that was absolutely brutal. At one point last season, weeks 11, 12, and 13, Ricky Pearsall ran 63 routes. He had 0 catches on those routes. He didn't register a yards per route run rate. On top of that, he was an older prospect coming out. But from a redraft perspective, when you look at the cost of this kind of player, and I'll throw Odunze in there too, because I apparently can't stop talking about him, I'm going to buy into that profile all day long. Second-year wide receivers are typically pretty good bets. And both Pearsall and Odunze, they have a clear path to upside. When that price tag is into wide receiver 4 territory, I care very, very little about a player's floor when I'm looking at their range of outcomes. If they bust, it's not going to sink my fantasy team. But it's hard to find many wideouts that deep into a season-long draft with the kind of upside that someone like Ricky Pearsall has or Rome Odunze has. Both are more than likely going to be targets for me this year. Dynasty's a different game with different price points and different risk profiles. my assumption when writing about Pearsall's profile, when knowing that Deebo Samuel was exiting San Francisco, my assumption was that Pearsall would be pretty expensive. But he's not. Everything has to do with cost. So from that perspective, he's someone that I've kind of changed my opinion on. Kind of. I just don't think there's going to be a situation that's quite like the Chase Brown one, where a player was a clear sell for me, and that player then became a clear buy, because I didn't see Pearsall quite that way to start the offseason. This next question is from Jamie Cardy. It says, "Hey JJ, my question is a general look at running backs in rookie drafts. Do you find that competition or lack thereof in the backfield moves a player's ADP more than it should? Does the ambiguous backfield theory apply to rookie drafts? RJ Harvey and Caleb Johnson versus players like Bashaw Tutin and Jarquez Hunter come to mind. Is the gap in talent as big as the gap in ADP? Or do the later guys present better value with the assumption that if they're good, they'll earn a strong share?" So you have to go back to my basic way of looking at Dynasty. With any team build, you're really looking at two things. You're looking at the value of the team, and you're looking at the production of the team. On the value side, you have to consider what the market is paying for a player, even if that player is not as usable as you think the market believes. Like, I could have some painting that I really don't like, but if it's worth $1 million, I would love to have that painting. Then there's the production side. What can a player give me right now in my starting lineup? What kind of points per game output can that player provide? There's also value in that, and you'll see it reflected in the Dynasty market. Like, let's just use those 4 running backs you threw out there as our example. RJ Harvey, Caleb Johnson, Bashaw Tutin, and Jarquez Hunter. Harvey and Johnson have more immediate opportunity right now in their backfields. Of course, injuries can happen and players can be traded, but Harvey and Johnson are going to project better in 2025 than Bashaw Tutin and Jarquez Hunter. That not only gives them an edge on the production side, but it does make them more valuable assets as well. Because Dynasty managers aren't going to want to wait around for a year hoping that Bashaw Tutin becomes Jacksonville's bell cow or that Jarquez Hunter takes over for Kyron Williams. They're not going to pay a premium for that, because those things aren't locks to happen. We're working with better information today than we will a year from now, because we have a better grasp on the backfield competition and the overall team makeup. Not only that, but Harvey and Johnson are just better prospects than at least Jarquez Hunter, in my opinion. You guys know that I love Hunter. He's been a frequent target of mine in rookie drafts. I probably have drafted him more than any other player. I loved him as a sleeper in this year's draft well before he happened to get drafted by LA. But when you factor in all the things the ZAP model factors in, which includes draft capital, Hunter did not score nearly as well, or at least as well, as the other 3 running backs. And that talent profile, the ZAP score, it's predictive. Otherwise, why would I be using it? Meanwhile, Johnson, Harvey, and Tutin, yes, even Tutin, they all had similar scores. But I think it's totally rational to not place Tutin in that same tier as the other 2 backs, because there's a much greater probability of him having to overcome more in order to be relevant right away. Not only that, but a player like Johnson has a shot to be the sole bell cow next year with Jaylen Warren being a free agent. Tank Bigsby could easily still be there in 2026. In fact, we should expect him to be there. So to your question, does the landing spot, the competition in that landing spot matter? Absolutely yes, on both the value and production front. You asking if someone's a better value or not in rookie drafts, that's a different story. I think in the example that you provided, there are some drafts where I definitely think a player like Tutin is a big value because his talent profile is really good in my eyes. It's what we want in fantasy football. But I think overall, their average draft positions of all of these running backs, they're all pretty fair. I wouldn't say one is some screaming value over the other, because gamers are properly weighing the short term versus the long term. But look, if I were to answer the general question of, do fantasy managers overrate backfield competition when it comes to prospects? I think my answer to that would be yes. Very often we see talent profiles ignored in favor of short-term situation, and that's never a good thing to do. It just so happens that your example includes 4 very talented running backs in my eyes. And look, this isn't totally a one-to-one comparison to what you're asking, but I did that study on day 3 picks earlier in the offseason, where I found that there's been zero correlation between where a day 3 running back was selected in rookie drafts and how well that player performed during his first 3 years in the NFL. And I know that Tootin and Hunter, they're both day 3 backs. But I loosely talk about day 3 players to just make it easier to communicate. The individual draft pick is what matters most in the ZAP model. Regardless though, there's no correlation between day 3 selections at running back and rookie drafts and how well those backs end up performing. Some of the biggest day 3 hits at running back over the last 5 or so years, they've been from backs who were afterthoughts in rookie drafts, like Kyron Williams and Isaiah Pacheco. You'd think there'd be more correlation here though, because we'd naturally elevate players who seem to be in good positions post-draft. And if they're in good positions, they're going to produce more. But oftentimes, that just gets you into trouble. Because instead of leaning on talent evaluation, you're leaning on strictly immediate opportunity. Now, that only partially answers the question because I didn't look at day 1 and day 2 backs. But like most things in fantasy football, this is going to be a mix. You have to lean into talent profiles first and foremost. That's the most important. A player needs to be good, generally speaking, in order to produce in fantasy football. But you also can't ignore competition. Like, we know that Bijan Robinson is a very, very good running back. But imagine that he shared a backfield with Devon Achane and Jahmyr Gibbs. What would his backfield share look like? It wouldn't be nearly as good as it is right now in Atlanta, that's for sure. So competition does matter. And you can think of those extreme hypotheticals to help you wrap your head around it. But in the real world, realistically, I'm definitely someone who believes that talent is more important than that competition side in Dynasty. Let's just not ignore the competition side altogether. The last question this week is from Twitter's from @FFB_fraud. It says, I get that the best comp for RJ Harvey in a Sean Payton offense might be Pierre Thomas. But in Denver's running back room last year, Javonte Williams saw 70 targets. Harvey is the direct replacement for J. Will. Is there any reason we shouldn't see 70 targets as a floor for RJ Harvey? I mean, as a floor, I don't think a 70 target outcome should be his floor. But 70 targets is definitely in his range of outcomes in general. Now, I mentioned the Pierre Thomas comp. I want to be clear about something. I don't actually think that's some super obvious prospect comp for RJ Harvey. I'm just pointing out that if you take a very limited sample of Sean Payton running backs, he's one who at least loosely compares to Harvey. Basically, I don't think RJ Harvey is an Alvin Kamara type running back or a Darren Sproles type running back. He's more like Pierre Thomas. Now, I talked about this a lot last year. I'm going to bring it up again. Sean Payton offenses love to target the running back. I always look at data to 2011, so I'll reference his time as head coach in New Orleans from 2011 to 2021. And he technically didn't coach in 2012. Let me read you where the Saints ranked in running back target share during those seasons across the league. So this is comparing them to every team in the NFL. Ready for this? First, third, second, fourth, sixth, second, first, second, third, second, and sixth. And sure, some of this is personnel driven. But since Payton left, the Saints have been 9th, 7th, and 1st in running back target share. So they've, in sum, not thrown it to running backs as much without Sean Payton. Which does kind of signal that this could be a Sean Payton thing and not just a personnel thing. And obviously, the Saints have had Alvin Kamara during that time without Payton. Payton didn't always have Alvin Kamara. Now, he's been coaching in Denver now for 2 seasons. In those 2 seasons, his offenses have ranked 1st and 5th in running back target share. I mean, we're talking 13 seasons where he's ranked no lower than 6th in running back target share. That's absolutely wild. You look at the backfield right now, it's Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime, and now RJ Harvey. McLaughlin's a fun player who can be a good change of pace back, but he hasn't seen a target share per game rate above 7.6% during his 2 years in the league. And that's in an offense that loves to target running backs. Audric Estime, meanwhile, wasn't a pass catcher in college, and he saw just 5 targets last year. The weird thing, though, is that I didn't find RJ Harvey's pass catching profile to be like amazing. I wouldn't have pegged him as someone who would walk into 70 targets in the NFL. I don't think there were like huge red flags to his receiving profile, but it definitely wasn't an elite receiving profile. It wasn't like Jahmyr Gibbs or something like that. Now, I wouldn't call Javonte Williams' receiving profile elite either, but it was a little bit better according to the ZAP model. That's why I still think the long-lasting value of RJ Harvey is still somewhat up in the air. Because Denver could just make backfield changes into 2026. But this year, in 2025, I am in. Like, I'm going to be higher than the market on RJ Harvey. I will have a lot of RJ Harvey on my fantasy teams. I can't sit here and preach about the importance of pass catching at running back and then say that I won't be aggressive with this kind of situation. So while I don't think that 70 targets is a fair floor assumption for almost any rookie running back in general, I definitely think that people should be targeting RJ Harvey in season-long drafts this year. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend. I'll catch you next week.